I had just finished going through my Uncle Harold Keene's will when the front door of the ranch house slammed open. No knock, no warning. A man named Victor Langley walked straight in with a county records officer at his shoulder like they owned the place. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't ask permission. He dropped a thick brown envelope onto the kitchen table and said, flat and confident, "This land isn't yours. The mineral rights were transferred to the Homeowners Association back in 2020. I opened the envelope and pulled out the document inside, a mineral rights assignment agreement. At the bottom was my uncle's signature. The date read April 22nd, 2020. The problem was simple and impossible to ignore. Uncle Harold had been dead for 7 months by then. I looked up from the paper. Langley was smiling, slow and satisfied, like a man watching a lock click shut. If you've ever had someone shove a forged signature in your face and calmly explain that your family's land now belongs to them, stay with me. This is the part where every lie they told started collapsing under its own weight. The letter from the estate attorney had arrived the previous Monday. I hadn't spoken to Uncle Harold in nearly 14 years, not since the blow-up between him and my mother over something neither of them ever explained. Now he was gone, and according to the documents spread across my table, he had left me everything. A 140-acre ranch in West Texas, a small savings account, and a handwritten note with just 4 words, "Don't let them take it." At the time, I didn't understand what he meant. I assumed it was the rambling warning of a man near the end. I was wrong. I just didn't realize how wrong yet. 3 days after the inheritance notice, another envelope arrived. This one was from something called the Cedar Bluff Homeowners Association. I had never heard of it. The letter stated that the property I had inherited was in violation of multiple community regulations, unpaid assessments totaling $43,800, unauthorized land use, failure to maintain boundary standards. At the bottom was a deadline, 30 days to resolve all violations or face legal action, including foreclosure. I called the estate attorney immediately. He had no record of any HOA tied to the property, no filings, no agreements, nothing. He suggested I visit the land in person and sort it out directly. So I booked a flight to Texas, rented a car, and drove nearly 4 hours into land so flat it felt endless. I thought I was going to handle paperwork. I wasn't even close. The ranch sat at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by mesquite and silence. I hadn't seen it since I was 11, the summer before everything in my family fractured. The house was still there, paint cracked, porch sagging slightly to the east, but that wasn't what stopped me. Along the entire northern edge of the property stood a brand new chain-link fence nearly 8 feet tall, on my land. Every 50 feet, bright signs were bolted to the metal. No trespassing, Cedar Bluff HOA authorized area. Beyond the fence, heavy equipment moved back and forth. Trucks, portable offices, drilling rigs, men in hard hats walking with purpose. Someone was running a full geological survey on land that every legal document I owned said belonged to me. I took photos, counted vehicles, zoomed in on company logos. Then I drove to the nearest neighbor. His name was Leonard Price, 74 years old, retired cattleman, lived about a third of a mile down the road. He opened the door holding a rifle and didn't lower it until I explained who I was. "Harold Keene's nephew," he said, like the words tasted bitter. "Figured you'd show up eventually." I asked him about the fence, the equipment, the HOA. He glanced past me toward the road, then back at my face. "That land's been spoken for a long time. Folks around here learn not to ask questions." I pressed him. He shook his head once. "Go talk to Langley. He runs it. Just don't expect answers you'll like." Then he closed the door. I stood on his porch for a full minute, trying to process what "spoken for" meant when applied to land someone legally owned. In town, I went straight to the county records office and requested every public filing tied to my uncle's property. Permits, liens, assessments, anything. The clerk was polite but evasive. She disappeared into a back room for nearly an hour. When she returned, she handed me a thin folder without meeting my eyes. Inside were 3 documents. The first was a geological survey permit authorizing exploration for oil and gas. The second was a preliminary assessment estimating significant reserves beneath the property. The third was an authorization granting survey rights to a company called Cedar Bluff Energy Group, LLC. The signature at the bottom made my stomach tighten. Victor Langley, President, Cedar Bluff HOA, Authorized Representative. The permit date was January 18th, 2020. Uncle Harold had died on June 2nd, 2019. Langley had signed off on drilling rights 7 months after my uncle was buried, and the company conducting the survey shared a name with the HOA demanding nearly $44,000 from me. I sat in my rental car for a long time after that. The pieces were starting to connect, but the picture they formed was ugly. How does an HOA authorize drilling on land it doesn't own? How does a county approve it? And who exactly were they that my uncle had warned me about? I searched Cedar Bluff Energy Group on my phone. Registered 16 months ago. P.O. box address in the same town. Registered agent Marcus Ellard, attorney at law. I searched Cedar Bluff HOA, founded 11 years earlier. President Victor Langley. Board members included a county commissioner named Thomas Reed, the same Thomas Reed who had approved the drilling permit as county liaison. Through the clerk's office window, I could see the clerk on the phone, watching me. That night, I sat on my uncle's porch listening to the wind move through the mesquite. Beyond the illegal fence, drills kept running. Men were pulling value out of land that wasn't theirs. An organization I'd never agreed to join claimed I owed them money I never owed, and a man named Victor Langley had forged documents to steal mineral rights worth far more than I could estimate. I didn't have a lawyer yet, I didn't have a plan, but I had photos, documents, and a growing list of names. My phone rang the next morning. A woman's voice, professional and polite, said Victor Langley would like to meet to discuss a mutually beneficial resolution regarding my uncle's estate. She suggested 1:30 p.m. that afternoon at the Cedar Bluff HOA administrative office. I agreed. I wanted to look him in the eye. The Cedar Bluff HOA office sat on the edge of town in a low brick building wedged between a farm supply store and a small insurance agency. Nothing flashy, nothing that suggested power. The parking lot was empty, except for a black SUV with darkened windows parked near the entrance. I pulled in beside it, shut off the engine, and took a breath that didn't calm anything. Inside, the air smelled like carpet cleaner and stale coffee. Victor Langley stood as soon as I entered, already smiling, already acting like we were old friends finally reconnecting. Early 60s, silver hair, crisp white button-down, no tie. The kind of man who dressed carefully to look harmless. "Evan, right?" he said warmly. "Harold talked about you now and then. Said you were the sharp one in the family." Behind him, framed photos lined the wall. Langley shaking hands with local officials, ribbon cuttings, smiles frozen in time. He didn't point to them. He didn't need to. Near the door sat a young woman with a tablet balanced on her knees. She didn't introduce herself. Her fingers moved quickly, but I noticed the slight tremor in her hands. "That's Melissa," Langley said, catching my glance. "She handles our administrative records. Don't mind her." He waited exactly 2 seconds before continuing, a man who understood silence as leverage. "I understand you've had some confusion about your uncle's property," he said, sliding a folder across the desk. Inside were copies of the same documents I'd already seen: the drilling permit, the preliminary assessment, the forged agreement. "Your uncle entered into a limited arrangement with the HOA years ago, survey access in exchange for certain fee considerations. Unfortunately, he passed before everything was finalized. That's what led to the outstanding assessments you were notified about." He slid another document toward me. "A clean solution," he said. "You sign over the mineral rights to Cedar Bluff Energy Group, our development arm, and in return we waive all outstanding fees, withdraw legal action, and issue a payment of $48,000, fair market value." I read the document carefully, dense language, carefully written to obscure what mattered. Signing meant surrendering all mineral rights permanently, acknowledging HOA authority over land it never legally controlled, waiving the right to dispute past actions. Buried deep was a non-disclosure clause that barred me from ever speaking about any of this. $48,000 for resources worth exponentially more, silence included. "I'll need time to review this with an attorney," I said. Langley nodded, calm as ever. "Of course, take whatever time you need." He straightened a pen on his desk, aligning it perfectly with the folder's edge. "But the compliance deadline is 24 days away. If we don't have a resolution by then, the board will proceed with enforcement, not a threat, a countdown." He stood and extended his hand. "Your uncle was difficult, stubborn, didn't know when to accept reasonable terms. This community has a long memory, Evan. Outsiders stirring things up tend to regret it." I shook his hand without responding. As I turned to leave, Melissa spoke without looking up. "The restroom's down the hall on the left," she said quietly. It was an odd thing to say. I hesitated. Then I walked down the hall. Behind the paper towel dispenser was a folded slip of paper, wedged tight. 4 words, written fast. "Check the 2016 meeting minutes." I didn't know who Melissa really was. I didn't know what it had cost her to leave that note. But people don't take risks like that without reason. In my car, my phone buzzed. An email from Marcus Ellery, attorney at law, representing Cedar Bluff HOA. Subject: Notice of Administrative Enforcement Proceedings. They were filing a lien against the property. A hearing would be scheduled within 13 days. Contesting it required posting a bond equal to the alleged debt, $43,800. The email timestamp read 1:42 p.m. I was still in Langley's office at that time. He had never planned to wait for my answer. 3 days later, I found the post, a local community forum, zoning disputes, school football scores. Someone had started a thread titled, "Outside Claim Threatens Our Community's Stability." It described an unnamed individual arriving to seize property he had never cared about, property maintained by residents for a decade. It accused him of planning to exploit natural resources for personal gain, claimed he had already threatened legal action. The post had over 1,800 views. The comments weren't random. One claims to have verified through county sources that I had outstanding debts in another state, a lie, but detailed enough to sound real. Another alleged my uncle had been investigated for land fraud before his death, false, but dressed in official language. The third came from a woman claiming to work at the county records office. She said she had personally witnessed me requesting sealed documents I had no right to see. I recognized her description immediately. This wasn't concern, it was coordination. That evening, I called Laura McIntyre, a property attorney in Austin, recommended by the estate lawyer. She listened without interrupting. "They're building a narrative," she said when I finished. "If the town believes you're the villain before you ever reach court, you're already behind. Document everything, say nothing publicly, and find those meeting minutes." The next day, hostility turned physical. At the grocery store, the cashier placed my change on the counter instead of handing it to me. At the gas station, a man in a lifted truck watched me fill my tank, then made a call without breaking eye contact. When I passed Leonard Price's driveway, his blinds were drawn, though his truck was home. Fear was currency here. Langley had been collecting it for years. That afternoon, my phone rang. Unknown local number. "You should take the deal," a flat voice said. "The hearing's been scheduled, hasn't it? Things move fast when Victor wants them to." The line went dead. That night, I opened the box of documents my uncle had left behind. Old tax records, photos, handwritten notes about cattle prices. At the bottom was an envelope marked "Not Sent." Inside was a letter dated 2016, addressed to someone at the Texas General Land Office. 3 pages of cramped handwriting. It described escalating pressure from the HOA, fees, boundary disputes, false code violations. A meeting in 2015 when Langley first approached him about mineral rights. One paragraph stopped me cold. "They have been planning to take this land since they learned what's underneath it. I have proof, but I am afraid of what they will do if I come forward. I have seen what happens to people who fight them." My uncle hadn't been confused. He'd been cornered. He died 2 years after writing that letter. Now the trap was closing on me. The morning after I found my uncle's unsent letter, I woke up knowing the clock wasn't just ticking. It was being actively pushed forward by people who wanted me off balance. Fear wasn't accidental here. It was scheduled. Before noon, another message hit my inbox. This one came through certified courier. Thick paper, legal language meant to overwhelm before it even made sense. 3 documents inside, each one worse than the last. The first was a formal demand letter from Ellery and Finch, attorneys for the Cedar Bluff HOA. I was being ordered to transfer all mineral rights within 7 days or face judicial action to void the inheritance entirely. They cited a clause buried in the Texas Property Code, abandonment by neglect. According to them, property left inadequately maintained for more than 5 years could be reclaimed under community authority. The second document was a purchase offer. Cedar Bluff Land Holdings, LLC. Same registered agent, same attorney, same shell, different label. They were offering $71,000 for the entire property, land, structures, subsurface rights, conditional on acceptance within the same 7-day window. The third was a revised lien notice. The amount had increased to $51,200. No explanation, no breakdown, just a larger number and a sharper deadline. I called Laura McIntyre and read everything to her line by line. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, there was silence on the other end, long enough to feel heavy. "They're not trying to win," she said finally. "They're trying to exhaust you. Every deadline forces a response. Every response costs time and money. They're betting you run out before they do." I asked her if they could actually take the land. "In a fair system, no," she said. "But this county isn't operating in isolation. The clerk's office is compromised. One of the commissioners approving permits sits on the HOA board. If you walk into that hearing without proof of deliberate fraud, you're playing their game on their field." 3 days until the ownership hearing, 7 days until the settlement deadline expired. Every option demanded resources I didn't have or surrender I wouldn't give. That night, I spread everything across the kitchen table. The forged permit dated after my uncle's death, the lien notices, his 2016 letter, the missing years between that letter and his death. Something had happened in that gap, something that made Langley confident enough to forge signatures and move equipment onto land he didn't own. Melissa's note echoed in my head. Check the 2016 meeting minutes. On the 11th day, I made a decision. I drafted a formal response rejecting both offers. Under Texas public records law, I demanded full copies of all HOA meeting minutes from 2014 through 2019, complete financial ledgers, itemized assessment records, and all correspondence between the HOA and Cedar Bluff Energy Group. Laura added citations that made the request legally impossible to ignore. As I signed my name, I knew exactly what I was doing. This wasn't negotiation anymore. It was escalation. The response came the next morning, not from Ellery, a text from an unknown number. They're destroying records tonight. Storage unit behind the community center. I can't help anymore. I'm sorry. I read it 3 times. If I went near that storage unit and got caught, I would become exactly what they were already calling me, a trespasser, a criminal, proof of their narrative in a single frame. But if the message was true and I did nothing, whatever evidence existed would be gone by morning. I thought about my uncle writing letters he was too afraid to send, about Langley's calm warning that people here didn't like outsiders causing trouble. Staying safe hadn't saved my uncle. It had only made him easier to erase. I made 2 calls. The first was to Laura. File an emergency motion, I told her. Temporary restraining order, document preservation. Name the HOA, Langley, and Ellery's firm. File it tonight. She warned me it would pour gasoline on everything. I told her I understood. The second call was to a number from my uncle's old address book. Mark Jensen, investigative reporter, land rights. He answered on the 3rd ring. I told him I had a story about an HOA using forged documents to steal land from a dead man. I told him evidence might disappear tonight. When can I see it? He asked. Tomorrow morning, I said, if there's anything left. I drove toward the community center just after sunset, not to break in, not to confront anyone. I parked on a public road with my phone ready and my lights off. A single light glowed inside the storage building. At 9:22 p.m., 2 men arrived and unlocked a unit. They carried out 4 filing boxes and loaded them into a white cargo van with no markings. At 11:47 p.m., a 3rd man showed up. I recognized him instantly from the photos on Langley's wall. County Commissioner Thomas Reed. He spoke with the others, gestured toward the boxes, then toward the road, toward where I was parked. At 22:19 p.m., the unit was locked. The van headed east. Reed drove west. I stayed until midnight recording plate numbers and timestamps. The next morning, Mark Jensen pulled into the ranch in a dented pickup. He'd been covering land disputes for over 20 years. He didn't waste time. Show me, he said. I laid it all out. The inheritance papers, the forged permit, the fake assessments, my uncle's unsent letter, the photos from the storage unit. When he compared the forged signature to a legitimate one from my uncle's files, he didn't need to say much. I know a document examiner in Dallas. If this is confirmed, that's criminal fraud, not civil, criminal. That afternoon, another text came in. Check your uncle's mailbox. I didn't move for a full minute. Then I drove to the end of the dirt road and approached the rusted box cautiously. Inside was a manila envelope, photocopies, HOA meeting minutes dated September 3rd, 2016. Closed session. Attendees listed Victor Langley, Marcus Ellery, Thomas Reed. 3 others I didn't recognize. Agenda item, strategic acquisition of Keene property pursuant to mineral development opportunity. The language was careful, sanitized, but the meaning was clear. Owner has declined voluntary transfer. Recommend escalating compliance pressure. Motion to authorize preliminary lien documentation approved unanimously. Explore alternative transfer mechanisms. Alternative transfer mechanisms. They had planned this before my uncle died, before I ever existed in their calculations. That evening, Leonard Price knocked on my door. He handed me a folder without stepping inside. Old clippings, transfer records, 3 death certificates over the last 11 years, all landowners who challenged HOA authority. I'm not saying anyone did anything, he said quietly. I'm saying people who fight Langley tend to have bad timing. 20 minutes later, Laura called. The judge had granted the restraining order. Document destruction was now illegal. But the hearing had been moved up. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. They were accelerating because they felt exposure closing in. I didn't sleep. By dawn, every document was sorted across the table. Laura arrived at 6:15 a.m. and divided them into piles. Admissible, risky, dangerous. The dangerous pile grew fastest.
The meeting minutes were explosive but anonymous. Using them directly would expose who leaked them. In a town this small, that could end lives. A text buzzed. "Please don't use my name. I have a daughter, 4th grade. I can't lose this job." Laura looked at me after I showed her. "We use the minutes as a roadmap," she said, "not evidence. We force Langley to contradict himself under oath." It was slower, riskier, but it didn't burn anyone else to win. At 8:30, I parked outside the courthouse. Mark Jensen stood on the steps, notebook ready. Inside, Langley sat with Ellery, calm and polished. Thomas Reed sat in the gallery. The judge took the bench. I carried only what I could prove. The gamble was about to begin.
Judge Elena Vargas took the bench exactly at 9 a.m., her expression neutral, unreadable. The courtroom was already full, not crowded, but heavy, the kind of silence that settles when people expect something ugly to surface. Victor Langley sat at the respondent's table beside Marcus Ellery, both in tailored suits that signaled confidence and money. Thomas Reed sat in the gallery, 2 rows back, hands folded, eyes forward. Melissa wasn't there. The bailiff called the case. I stood at the petitioner's table with a single folder, thinner than it should have been for a fight this large. Laura sat beside me, calm but alert, already watching the judge's reactions. Judge Vargas looked over her glasses. "Mr. Keene, you are contesting the validity of liens and mineral rights transfers associated with the inherited property. You have 15 minutes. 15 minutes to dismantle a scheme that had been running for years." I approached the bench and began with what couldn't be argued: the deed transfer through probate, the certified death certificate, 14 consecutive years of property tax payments made directly to the county, agricultural classification records predating the HOA's formation. I laid each document out as I spoke, methodical, controlled. "The respondent claims I owe $43,800 in HOA assessments," I said. "But under state property law, land predating an association's formation is exempt from mandatory membership unless the owner explicitly opts in. My uncle never opted in." Ellery stood immediately. "Your Honor, that exemption applies only to actively maintained agricultural land. This property was abandoned for over a decade. I expected it." Laura slid forward the affidavit Leonard Price had signed that morning, attesting to regular upkeep until my uncle's death in 2019. Utility records followed, maintenance invoices, enough to puncture the abandonment claim. Judge Vargas reviewed the affidavit, then looked at Ellery. "You'll have the opportunity to challenge this during cross-examination." She turned back to me. "Proceed." "The core issue isn't assessments," I said. "It's fraud. The respondent submitted a mineral rights agreement allegedly signed by my uncle on April 22, 2020. I placed the document on the bench, then the death certificate beside it. My uncle died on June 2, 2019. He could not have signed this agreement. The courtroom shifted. Murmurs rippled and died as the judge raised a hand. Ellery stood slowly. "Your Honor, we believe the date reflects a clerical error. The agreement was executed earlier and misdated during processing." I didn't argue. I asked. "Then I request Mr. Langley testify under oath regarding the execution of this agreement." Judge Vargas considered for a beat. "Mr. Langley, take the stand." Langley moved with practiced ease, swore the oath, and settled into the chair like it belonged to him. He met my eyes without flinching. "Mr. Langley," I said evenly, "describe the meeting where my uncle agreed to transfer mineral rights." "Routine administrative discussion," he replied smoothly. "Your uncle visited our office, expressed interest in development participation, and signed the paperwork." "When did this meeting occur?" "I don't recall the exact date." "Was it before or after September 3, 2016? His eyes flicked to Ellery for a fraction of a second. "September 3rd, I'm not sure what that signifies." "September 3rd, 2016, the date of a closed board session discussing strategic acquisition of my uncle's property." Langley shifted slightly. "I attend many meetings. I can't be expected to remember every agenda item." "Do you recall authorizing preliminary lien documentation against his property?" "I don't recall." "Do you recall the phrase alternative transfer mechanisms?" The room went still. Langley's jaw tightened. "I don't appreciate the implication." Judge Vargas leaned forward. "Mr. Langley, answer the question." "There may have been discussions about long-term planning, nothing improper." I turned slightly toward the gallery. "Your Honor, I request the court subpoena all HOA meeting minutes from 2015 to 2018 for verification." Ellery was on his feet. "Objection, fishing expedition." Judge Vargas didn't look at him. "Denied. Given the discrepancies presented, the request is reasonable." A sound cut through the room. Leonard Price stood in the gallery. "Your Honor, I was in the HOA building that day. I heard Mr. Langley say that if Harold Keene didn't cooperate, ownership would be made difficult for him." Gasps, whispers, heads turning. The judge struck the gavel once. "Order." She looked directly at Mr. Reed. "Mr. Reed, remain seated. You'll be available for questioning." Mr. Reed's face had gone pale. Judge Vargas turned back to Langley. "Given the alleged forgery, the timing inconsistencies, eyewitness testimony, and claims of document destruction involving a public official, this court is ordering an expanded investigation." Langley's composure cracked. "This is harassment. He abandoned that land and now wants to cash in." "Enough," the judge said coldly. "This hearing is suspended. All HOA records are to be preserved immediately. Any attempt to alter or destroy evidence will be treated as obstruction." She looked at me. "Mr. Keene, possession remains with you. No liens enforced, no transfers executed." Then to Langley. "This court is forwarding findings to the district attorney." The gavel fell. Langley stood and left without looking back. Ellery followed, phone already to his ear. Reed slipped out a side door. The courtroom erupted. Reporters surged. Laura pulled me toward the exit before questions could land. "This isn't over," she said quietly. "This just made it public." As we stepped into the fluorescent hallway, cameras flashing, I understood something clearly. The silence that had protected them was gone. And silence was the only thing they'd ever relied on. The investigation didn't move fast. It didn't move cleanly. It moved the way power always resists exposure, slowly, angrily, and with enough noise to make people doubt what they'd already seen. In the first week after the hearing, subpoenas went out to the Cedar Bluff HOA, to Cedar Bluff Energy Group, to Ellery's firm, and to the county records office. The restraining order froze their paper trail in place, but everyone involved knew freezing wasn't the same as revealing. Boxes existed. Files existed. The question was whether they still meant anything by the time anyone was allowed to read them. Victor Langley disappeared from public view almost immediately. His nameplate was removed from the HOA office door. The black SUV stopped appearing in town. People said he was handling personal matters, which in this county meant lawyers were talking louder than he was. Thomas Reed resigned from the county commission 5 days later, citing health concerns. No one believed that either, but belief had never been the currency here. Silence had. Mark Jensen's first article ran 10 days after the hearing. He didn't speculate. He didn't editorialize. He laid out dates, signatures, discrepancies, and conflicts of interest with surgical precision. Forged documents dated after a landowner's death, drilling permits approved by a commissioner sitting on the HOA's advisory committee, a homeowners association asserting authority over agricultural land that predated its existence by decades. The article spread fast, faster than anything else had so far. People who had ignored forum posts and courthouse whispers paid attention when the story came with scanned documents and timestamps. By the third day, regional outlets picked it up. By the end of the week, the state attorney general's office announced a formal inquiry into Cedar Bluff HOA operations. That announcement changed the temperature of the town overnight. Fear didn't vanish, but it shifted direction. The same people who had avoided eye contact at the grocery store now watched from a distance, cautious, calculating. The gas station man still stared, but he didn't make calls anymore. Leonard Price stopped closing his blinds. He didn't wave, but he didn't hide either. That was progress of a kind. Laura warned me not to confuse visibility with safety. Power rarely collapses cleanly. It fractures. Pieces fall where they may, and people caught underneath don't always care who was right. 2 weeks into the investigation, agents from the Attorney General's office executed search warrants on the HOA office and Ellery's firm. Computers were seized, financial records copied, emails pulled. The county clerk was placed on administrative leave pending review of her involvement. She avoided cameras, but not before reporters photographed her leaving the building with a box of personal items pressed tight to her chest. I didn't feel satisfaction watching that footage. I felt confirmation. That was worse. Satisfaction fades, confirmation hardens. The storage unit boxes mattered more than anything else. When agents located them across the county line, stacked and unopened, it became clear someone had panicked and made a mistake. Burning evidence leaves ash, moving it leaves trails. Inside were meeting minutes going back 12 years, internal correspondence, fee schedules that changed without notice, and spreadsheets documenting pressure campaigns against specific properties. My uncle's name appeared more than once, not as an owner, as a problem. That language showed up again and again, non-compliant, obstructive, escalate.
The pattern wasn't subtle once it was visible. It had just been protected by obscurity and fear. Langley was indicted 36 days after the hearing, 12 counts at first: forgery, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit theft. The charges expanded as investigators traced money through shell companies that all funneled back to the same small circle of accounts. Ellery lost his license before he was charged. The Bar Association moved faster than the courts. Lawyers who know the system tend to fear it when it turns. Reed was arrested quietly at his home on 6:10 a.m. on a Thursday. No press release until the paperwork was signed. Abuse of office, obstruction, coordinating fraudulent permitting. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He was the first one to look small in public. The HOA board dissolved by court order 2 months later. Not restructured, dissolved. An external administrator was appointed to oversee remaining obligations while lawsuits piled up. Families started coming forward then. Not all at once, one at a time. A rancher whose father had signed something he didn't understand. A widow who'd lost land after fee notices doubled without explanation. A couple who'd sold under pressure because foreclosure threats arrived faster than legal advice. 11 cases in total made it into active review. Others were too old. Statutes had run out. Damage done quietly stays done. Through all of it, Melissa remained invisible. She didn't testify. She wasn't named. Her job ended 2 months after the hearing, but not publicly. She moved to another county, another office, another life. I received one message from the same unknown number. "Thank you for keeping your word." No signature, no follow-up. I deleted it and didn't try to reply. Some exits should stay clean. The land itself became quieter as the investigation deepened. The illegal fence came down under court supervision. The drilling equipment was removed within a week of the injunction. Tire tracks faded as grass grew back unevenly where heavy machines had compressed the soil. I walked the boundary one morning and realized it was the first time I'd done so without feeling watched. That didn't mean I wasn't. It meant the watching had changed hands. Energy companies reached out once the indictments became public. Carefully worded inquiries, market valuations, lease structures. Numbers that would have made Langley smile the way he had in my kitchen that first day. I didn't sign anything, not then. I needed time to decide what ownership meant now that it was real and uncontested. Laura didn't push. She understood that winning something and knowing what to do with it are separate problems. 4 months after the hearing, the Attorney General's office released its findings: systematic fraud, coordinated misuse of county authority, intentional pressure campaigns designed to force involuntary transfers. It wasn't poetic, it was bureaucratic. That mattered. Bureaucratic language sticks. It gets cited. It becomes precedent. The system doesn't apologize, but it records. I stood on my uncle's porch the night the report went public, the same porch where I'd sat weeks earlier, surrounded by questions and men who thought paper could erase bloodlines. The wind moved through the mesquite the same way it always had. That constancy felt heavier than relief. My uncle had lived with fear long enough to write letters he never sent. He died believing silence was safer than truth. I couldn't change that. I could only decide what followed it. The land stayed with me. The mineral rights stayed with me. That part was settled in court and in record. What wasn't settled was what kind of owner I intended to be now that ownership wasn't theoretical. The town would remember this longer than any verdict. Some would remember me as the outsider who broke something, others as the one who stopped it. Both would be wrong in useful ways. The truth was smaller and harder. I had refused to let a lie stand because it was convenient. Power hates witnesses. That was the lesson underneath everything else. Langley hadn't been bold because he was smart. He was bold because no one was watching, and fewer were willing to speak. Once that changed, everything he'd built collapsed into paperwork and court dates, slow, incomplete, but irreversible. The trials would take years. Appeals, settlements, quiet resignations. That was future noise. What mattered now was that the land was quiet again, and quiet without fear sounds different. I locked the front door that night and walked down the steps into the dark, aware that ownership isn't just holding something, it's standing in front of it when someone else decides they want it more.
The trials didn't arrive like justice usually does in movies. There was no sudden reckoning, no dramatic collapse of everyone involved. What came instead was time. Slow, grinding, expensive time. Depositions first, then motions, then counter-motions written in language designed to bury responsibility beneath procedure. Victor Langley's legal team attacked everything except the evidence itself. They questioned jurisdiction, challenged search warrants, argued procedural overreach. It was all delay. Delay buys memory loss. Delay exhausts witnesses. Delay convinces people to stop paying attention. And in a town like this, attention was the only thing that had ever kept men like Langley from doing whatever they wanted. I was deposed twice in the first 3 months, hours at a time in windowless rooms, answering the same questions asked 3 different ways by 3 different attorneys who already knew the answers. They wanted inconsistencies. They wanted fatigue. They wanted me to say something careless they could stretch into doubt. I didn't give them that. I stuck to dates, documents, and facts. Laura sat beside me every time, silent unless needed, watching for traps I couldn't see while speaking. When Langley was deposed, I wasn't allowed in the room, but I was told later that he tried the same strategy he'd used everywhere else: calm denial, selective memory, outrage at implication. It worked until investigators placed the internal emails in front of him, time-stamped, archived, and impossible to explain away. After that, he stopped answering some questions entirely. Thomas Reed broke first, not publicly, but legally. His attorney requested a closed session with prosecutors and brought boxes of his own, records he'd kept separate from the HOA files, calendars, emails forwarded to a private account, notes from meetings he'd never expected anyone else to see. Reed wasn't confessing out of guilt, he was negotiating survival. The charges against him carried real prison time, and he knew Langley wouldn't protect him now that the shield was gone. When Reed flipped, the case stopped being about individual fraud and became about organized abuse of authority. That changed everything. Families continued coming forward, not loudly, not together. One would call Laura's office and hang up, then call again a week later. Another would show up with a shoebox of old letters and fee notices that didn't make sense until someone explained the pattern. Each story matched the last in shape, if not detail. Pressure escalated slowly, compliance framed as cooperation, resistance punished through paperwork until surrender felt like relief. Seeing it laid out like that stripped away the last illusion that any of this had been accidental. Mark Jensen published follow-ups every time filings became public. He never wrote like he was chasing a villain. He wrote like he was documenting a system. That made it harder to dismiss. People can argue about motives. They struggle to argue with spreadsheets. By the 4th article, no one in town pretended not to know anymore. The silence that had once protected Langley turned into a liability. Associations across the county quietly amended bylaws. Meetings were suddenly open. Audits appeared where none had existed before. No one announced why. They didn't need to. The energy companies kept circling. This time, the offers came through attorneys, not landmen, market rate leases, signing bonuses with more zeros than I'd ever expected to see attached to my name. It was tempting in a way that surprised me, not because of greed, but because of exhaustion. Signing would end questions. It would finalize something. Laura warned me not to decide while angry or tired. That advice mattered more than the numbers. I drove the land often during those months, walked the fence lines, stood where the drilling rigs had been, and imagined what my uncle had seen when he realized what was happening beneath his feet. He'd been alone, old, surrounded by people who smiled while tightening pressure he didn't have the energy to fight. Understanding that didn't make me heroic. It made me angry in a way that didn't fade. 6 months after the hearing, the first plea deal was announced. Not Langley, one of the secondary board members, reduced charges in exchange for testimony. The pattern repeated. Each deal added weight to the case. Each confirmation narrowed Langley's options. His attorneys shifted tone, less outrage, more negotiation. That shift didn't feel like victory. It felt like inevitability. The town adjusted around the case. Life continued in visible ways while everything underneath stayed tense. People watched what they said, who they said it to. Leonard Price started sitting on his porch again in the evenings. Sometimes we talked, mostly we didn't. Presence was enough. Once he told me he'd been ready to leave before all this started, sell what he could, go somewhere quiet. "Guess I'll stay," he said, like it surprised him. I understood that feeling. Staying wasn't comfort, it was defiance. Melissa never reached out again. I didn't expect her to. People who survive systems like this don't linger near the wreckage. I hoped wherever she landed was quieter, safer. That was all anyone could reasonably hope for after risking as much as she had.
The county implemented interim oversight rules while the larger reforms wound through committees and hearings, mandatory disclosures, independent audits, limits on enforcement authority. None of it erased what had already happened, but it changed what could happen next. That mattered. Systems don't heal, they adapt under pressure. The trick is making sure the pressure doesn't let up too soon. On the 1-year mark from the day Victor Langley walked into my uncle's kitchen, I stood in the same room and looked at the same table. The marks were still there, old scratches, water rings, places where paper had been spread and folded and argued over. The land outside was quiet in a way that it hadn't been in years. Not peaceful, just honest. No machinery, no signs, no men pretending authority they didn't have. Langley's trial date was finally set, another 8 months out. More filings, more chances for things to go wrong. I'd learned not to expect closure on a schedule. The best I could do was stay visible and prepared. Power depends on fatigue. I wasn't done being tired, but I wasn't done standing either. That night, I locked the door and turned off the lights. In the dark, the house sounded old but steady. Whatever else happened next, the land had witnesses now. Not just me, not just documents. People who knew what silence cost and what breaking it demanded. That knowledge didn't guarantee safety, it guaranteed memory. And memory was the one thing men like Langley had never been able to control once it spread.
The first verdict came down on a Wednesday afternoon, almost quietly. No cameras in the hallway, no crowd pressing against the courthouse doors, just a clerk reading charges into the record and a jury foreperson answering yes where it mattered. Victor Langley was found guilty on 8 counts, including forgery and conspiracy to commit theft. The remaining charges were folded into sentencing. He stood when the judge spoke his name, shoulders stiff, face drained of that practiced calm he had worn like armor for years. When the sentence was announced, a number of years long enough to feel real, he didn't look back at the gallery. He walked out the way he'd always walked away from problems, straight ahead, pretending nothing behind him mattered anymore. The trials for the others stretched on. Marcus Ellery accepted a plea deal that stripped him of his license permanently and sent him to federal custody for a shorter term in exchange for testimony. Thomas Reed fought longer, insisting he'd only followed procedures as he understood them, until emails surfaced showing him coordinating permit approvals around HOA board meetings. His conviction came 6 months after Langley's. Abuse of office carries a different weight when it's no longer abstract. When the sentence was read, his wife cried quietly in the back row. No one else did. By then, the town had learned how to talk about what happened without lowering their voices. Not comfortably, not kindly, but openly. Names were used, dates were remembered. Stories that had once been told only at kitchen tables came out in public meetings, in sworn statements, in testimony that shook as often from anger as from fear. 11 families testified formally. Others submitted affidavits. Some stories were too old to prosecute, but they weren't too old to hear. Each one added another layer to a picture that no longer needed imagination to be understood. I stayed through all of it, every hearing I was allowed to attend, every day the land was mentioned in open court. Laura said I didn't need to be present anymore, that the case could stand without me now. She was right, legally, but absence has a way of being rewritten later, presence doesn't. So I sat in hard benches and listened to men explain how they'd convinced themselves what they did was necessary, reasonable, inevitable. None of them said the word greed. They didn't need to. It sat between every sentence like a confession they hoped no one would notice. Outside the courtroom, life kept finding ways to intrude. Energy companies didn't stop calling. They adjusted their tone, their numbers, their promises. One offer came with a proposal to build a private access road. Another included upfront payments large enough to solve problems I hadn't known how to name before all this began. Laura reminded me that waiting wasn't indecision, it was choice. I believed her. Still, the weight of it pressed in ways courtrooms never had. Winning a fight doesn't automatically tell you what comes next. It just removes the excuse not to decide. The county implemented permanent oversight reforms before the final trial concluded. Mandatory audits, public access to HOA financials, limits on enforcement actions against non-member properties. It was enough to look impressive on paper and limited enough not to scare anyone who still benefited from the system. Progress often arrives negotiated. That didn't make it meaningless, it made it fragile. Fragile things require attention. I understood that now. Leonard Price testified twice. The second time, his voice didn't shake. He didn't dramatize. He just said what he'd seen and heard over the years, names and dates delivered with the precision of a man who had nothing left to lose by telling the truth. Afterward, he sat beside me on the courthouse steps and watched people file past. "Thought I'd be more afraid," he said. "Turns out I was just tired. I knew the feeling. Fear drains. Speaking doesn't restore energy, but it stops the leak." Melissa never appeared in court. She didn't need to. The evidence she'd helped uncover spoke loudly enough without a face attached to it. I heard through Laura that she'd moved again, farther this time, taking a job that had nothing to do with records or compliance or boards. That seemed right. Some people don't need acknowledgement. They need distance. I hoped she had it. The land itself changed in quieter ways. Without machinery, the ground began to heal unevenly. Ruts softened, grass reclaimed space. I spent mornings walking the boundaries, not out of paranoia, but familiarity. Ownership felt different when it wasn't under threat, less sharp, more demanding. Responsibility has a way of expanding once fear recedes. I thought often about my uncle during those walks, about how alone he must have felt trying to hold ground against a system designed to wear him down slowly enough that no one noticed. Knowing that didn't bring him back. It did give shape to what I owed the land now that it was mine without question. The final sentencing hearing for Langley happened nearly 2 years after he first walked into that kitchen. The judge read the sentence carefully, citing aggravating factors, patterns of behavior, abuse of trust. Langley listened without expression. When it was over, he was led away. No speech, no apology. Power rarely admits error once it's stripped. It just exits. Afterward, reporters asked if I felt vindicated. The word didn't fit. Vindication implies satisfaction. What I felt was steadier than that and less dramatic, something closer to alignment. The facts now matched the reality I'd been living in since that first envelope hit the table. That mattered. Reality mismatched from record is how people like Langley operate. Fixing that mismatch doesn't feel triumphant, it feels necessary. I made my decision about the land shortly after the final verdict. I accepted a limited lease on part of the property, structured through a cooperative rather than a single corporation. The terms required environmental oversight and community revenue sharing set at 14%. The remaining acreage was placed under a conservation easement, not because it was noble, but because it was deliberate. The land would produce, but not in ways that erased its future or my uncle's past. Laura reviewed every line. She didn't argue. She understood why this mattered beyond numbers. The first check arrived 6 weeks later. I deposited it and sat in my car afterward, engine off, hands on the wheel, feeling nothing like the victory I'd imagined earlier in the fight. Money closes some doors and opens others. It doesn't end stories. It just changes who gets to tell them. The town adjusted again. Some people avoided me. Others nodded in passing. A few stopped to talk. Not about court, about weather, about crops, about nothing in particular. That was the real shift. When people stop framing you as a problem or a symbol and start treating you as background, it means something has settled. On the second anniversary of my arrival, I stood on the porch at dusk and watched the land darken into silhouettes. No fences, no signs, no trucks idling where they didn't belong. Somewhere beyond the horizon, appeals were still being filed, motions still argued. That noise would continue for years. But here, in this place, the ground was quiet in a way that didn't feel temporary. My uncle's warning was simple: don't let them take it. He hadn't said how. He hadn't promised safety. He just asked for resistance where silence would have been easier. Standing there, I understood that inheritance isn't just what's passed down, it's what's finished. I locked the door, not because I was afraid anymore, but because the day was done. Tomorrow would come whether I was ready or not. This time, I was. The months after the final verdict felt quieter than I expected. Not peaceful, just stripped of constant pressure. The phone stopped ringing at odd hours. No more certified letters slid under the door. No more strangers watching from trucks parked a little too close for comfort. The land existed without being contested, and that alone took time to adjust to. I stayed on the ranch longer than I planned, not out of nostalgia, but because leaving too quickly felt like abandoning something I had only just secured. The house still carried my uncle's presence in small ways. A chipped mug in the sink, a nail hammered crooked into the porch beam, paperwork tucked where no one would think to look. I sorted what needed sorting and left the rest as it was. Not everything needed closure to be understood. The cooperative began work on the leased acreage in late spring. They moved slowly, deliberately, under rules that required transparency and local oversight. No unmarked vans, no closed-door meetings. Representatives introduced themselves before stepping onto the land and explained exactly what they were doing and why. It shouldn't have felt remarkable, but it did. Leonard Price came by once to watch them set up initial equipment. He stood with his hands in his pockets, nodding occasionally, saying little. When they left for the day, he turned to me and said, "That's how it should have been from the start." He was right. It was a simple sentence for something that had taken years and indictments to enforce. The conservation easement drew quieter reactions. Some people understood immediately, others didn't see the point of protecting land that could be monetized further. I didn't explain myself to them. Explanations invite debate, and debate wasn't required. The land didn't need to justify itself to anyone anymore. It existed. That was enough. I walked those protected acres often, learning the ground the way you learn a language, slowly, by repetition rather than study. In doing so, I realized how little my uncle had truly been allowed to enjoy what he owned. Possession without peace is a thin thing. I intended to avoid repeating that mistake. Mark Jensen published a final piece on the case a year after Langley was sentenced. It wasn't dramatic. It focused on what changed after the prosecutions and what hadn't. He quoted policy language, reform measures, and one anonymous source who said the county felt different now, like people were paying attention in rooms where attention had once been optional. I appreciated that framing. Villains make stories neat, systems make them honest. When I thanked him later, he shrugged and said he'd just written what the paperwork showed. That was his way of saying the truth had finally been loud enough to stand on its own. Laura visited once, months after everything was settled enough to breathe. We sat on the porch with coffee that had gone cold before either of us noticed. She admitted she hadn't expected the case to unfold the way it did, not because the evidence was weak, but because the resistance had been so embedded. Most people don't push once they realize how much pushing costs, she said. I didn't argue. I understood that I hadn't pushed because I was brave. I'd pushed because stopping hadn't been an option I could live with. Courage is easier to name from the outside than from inside the moment. The town continued its quiet recalibration. HOA meetings across the county saw higher attendance. Financial disclosures became routine rather than rare. None of it made headlines. That was fine. Headlines fade faster than habits. Leonard Price eventually sold part of his land to his daughter and moved closer to town. He said he wanted to be nearer people now. When he left, he shook my hand longer than necessary and told me to keep walking the boundaries even when no one was testing them. That's how you know what's yours, he said. It was advice earned the hard way. I never heard from Melissa again. Occasionally I wondered where she was, whether she felt safer or if the distance she'd put between herself and that office had been enough. I hoped it had. Some acts don't need acknowledgement to matter. They just need to remain unpunished. Knowing she'd walked away intact felt like a quiet victory that didn't belong to me alone. On the second anniversary of my uncle's death, I took his unsent letter out of the box one last time and read it again. The fear in his handwriting was still there, pressed into the page. So was his clarity. He had known exactly what was happening. He simply lacked the leverage to stop it. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back where it belonged. The truth no longer needed his fear to carry it forward. That was my role now, whether I liked it or not. I locked the house that evening and drove into town for dinner, something I hadn't done since the early days of the dispute. The waitress recognized me, but didn't change her tone. She asked what I wanted, wrote it down, and brought it without comment. Normal interactions felt heavier than confrontations ever had. Normal meant the story had settled into memory rather than urgency. That was the final shift. When conflict becomes memory, it loses its ability to dictate every choice. As I drove back under a sky stripped clean by wind, I thought about how easily everything could have gone differently. How one signature unchallenged, one meeting unexamined, one person choosing silence could have erased not just land but history. The system hadn't protected my uncle. It had nearly consumed him. But systems are made of people, and people change when enough light forces them to. That change never arrives cleanly or evenly. It arrives with cost. Someone always pays first. I parked at the edge of the property and walked the last stretch on foot, listening to insects and distant cattle. No machinery hummed, no engines idled. The ground felt solid beneath my boots, not because it had won, but because it had endured. Ownership finally felt like stewardship rather than defense. That distinction mattered more than any verdict or settlement. Before going inside, I stood for a moment and looked across the land my uncle had tried to protect alone. He hadn't lived to see the truth surface, but it had surfaced anyway. Not because I was special, but because silence had finally failed. I turned toward the house and locked the door behind me, not as an act of fear, but of habit. Tomorrow would bring its own work, its own decisions, its own risks. But the land would still be here. And this time, there would be no question about who it belonged to or how hard someone would have to fight to take it again.